Ever since you learned there might be a leopard in the dark, you've been afraid of it. Ancient humans knew there was one. So why weren't they scared? Picture this. It's 40,000 years ago. The sun drops behind the ridge, and within minutes, the world turns pitch black. No streetlights, no phone screen, no moon tonight. And somewhere out there, teeth, claws, things that hunt at night specifically because it's dark. By every modern instinct, this should be a nightmare. And yet the evidence tells a stranger story. The people living through those nights weren't paralyzed by fear the way you might imagine. They were prepared. And preparation, it turns out, is the opposite of fear. Let's start with the myth we need to tear down. We tend to picture our ancestors as huddled, trembling shapes at the mouth of a cave, jumping at every snapped twig. That image comes from us, from modern people who've spent their whole lives under artificial light, who've never had to actually live inside a moonless night. We project our own darkness anxiety backward onto people who had something we don't: total familiarity with it. Think about what fear actually is. Fear spikes when a threat is unpredictable, when you don't know what's coming or how to respond. But for someone born into a world without electricity, night wasn't an anomaly. It was half of every single day of their life. They didn't experience darkness as an interruption to normal life. Darkness was normal life. You don't fear the thing you've done 10,000 times. So the first reason ancient humans weren't crippled by nighttime dread is simple exposure. A child growing up around a fire circle learned from infancy what the dark sounded like, smelled like, felt like against the skin. They learned to distinguish the rustle of wind in dry grass from the rustle of something moving with intention. That's not bravery. That's expertise. And expertise quiets fear better than any pep talk ever could. Now let's talk about the fire, because fire changes everything. The controlled use of fire goes back at least 1 million years, with strong evidence for regular, habitual use by around 400,000 years ago. Once early humans could reliably keep a flame going through the night, they weren't just warm, they were armed. Nearly every predator that might stalk a human has an instinctive aversion to open flame. A fire wasn't just light. It was a wall, an invisible perimeter that most animals simply would not cross. And that changes the entire emotional experience of night. Imagine sitting inside that ring of firelight. Outside it, unknown. Inside it, your group, your tools, your food, your children, all lit and all safe. The fear doesn't vanish, but it gets contained. It gets pushed to the edge of the light and held there. Psychologically, that's enormous. Humans aren't afraid of danger existing somewhere in the abstract. We're afraid of danger being able to reach us. Fire drew a line danger mostly couldn't cross, and that line let people exhale. Here's the next piece, and it's one people rarely think about. Ancient humans weren't navigating the dark with human eyes alone. They were navigating it with generations of accumulated knowledge, passed down as story, as habit, as instinct drilled into muscle memory. They knew which caves flooded. They knew which slopes were safe to sleep on, and which funneled cold air like a trap. They knew the calls of nocturnal animals well enough to tell a hunting cry from a mating cry from a warning cry. What looks to us like superstition, a myth about a spirit that guards a certain valley, a taboo about never sleeping near a particular tree, was often, underneath the story, a practical survival rule, encoded so it would stick. Fear of the spirit in the ravine kept people out of a genuine rockslide zone. The story wasn't irrational. It was a memory device for a real hazard, wrapped in a form the whole tribe would actually remember and obey. Now consider the group itself. One of the most underrated human superpowers is that we are almost never facing the world alone. Ancient humans slept, traveled, and hunted in tight social units. There's real safety in numbers, but there's also something else: shared vigilance. When you're part of a group, you don't have to be alert every single second because someone else is. Studies on modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the San in the Kalahari, whose lifestyles echo ancient patterns, show rotating watches, communal sleeping arrangements, and a level of relaxed rest at night that would surprise people who assume prehistoric life was one long panic. Fear at its core often comes down to a feeling of being unwatched and unprotected. Ancient humans were rarely either. There's also the matter of the human ear. We think of ourselves as visual creatures, and we are, but in darkness, the ear becomes king. Ancient humans, without constant background noise, no traffic, no hum of electronics, no white noise, lived in an acoustic environment of incredible clarity. They could hear a footstep at a distance we'd find almost supernatural. That auditory sharpness functioned like an early warning system. You don't need to see the threat if you can hear it coming from 200 meters away, and you know exactly what kind of animal makes that particular sound. Confidence in your own senses is one of the most powerful antidotes to fear that exists. Let's flip the question for a second. Why do we assume darkness should be terrifying at all? Some researchers argue that a mild background wariness of the dark is likely wired into us, an ancient, low-level caution that kept our ancestors from wandering blindly into danger. But there's a massive difference between healthy caution and the specific, modern flavor of nighttime dread most people carry today. That modern fear is amplified by things ancient humans simply didn't have. Isolation in a room alone, disconnection from a tight-knit group, a lifetime of horror movies and campfire ghost stories designed purely to scare rather than to teach, and, critically, a near-total loss of practice. Most people today experience real, unlit darkness maybe a handful of times in their entire life. Of course it feels alien. Of course it feels threatening. You're a stranger in a room you never learned to walk through. Ancient humans were the opposite of strangers to the dark. They were fluent in it, and fluency breeds calm. There's also a broader psychological angle worth sitting with. Fear tends to explode when we feel a total lack of control. Ancient humans exercised enormous control over their nighttime environment, even without a single modern tool. They chose defensible sleeping sites, elevated ground, cave mouths facing away from prevailing wind, spots near water but not too near. They built barriers out of thorn bush. They kept fires fed in shifts through the night. Every one of these actions is a small act of control, and small acts of control, repeated, add up to something close to confidence. Confidence, not fearlessness, confidence. They knew the dark held risk. They simply also knew, deeply and specifically, what to do about it. Compare that to how a lot of people experience the dark today. Flicking on a phone flashlight in unfamiliar woods, heart pounding, with zero practical plan beyond get back to the car. That panic isn't proof that darkness is inherently more dangerous now. It's proof of how disconnected we've become from the specific, learnable skills our ancestors carried as second nature. So when you pull all of this together, the lifelong exposure that turned darkness into the familiar rather than the alien, the protective ring of firelight holding predators at bay, the inherited practical wisdom disguised as story and taboo, the safety and shared vigilance of the group, the sharpened senses tuned by silence, and the hands-on control they exercised over their own environment. A very different picture emerges. Ancient humans weren't fearless. They were something more useful than fearless. They were competent. And that's really the whole secret, isn't it? Fear doesn't dissolve because danger disappears. It dissolves because you know what you're looking at. Ancient humans stared into the same darkness we still flinch from today, and where we see an unknown void, they saw a landscape they'd walked 1,000 times before, lit at the edges by a fire they knew how to keep burning, and surrounded by people they trusted to watch the dark while they slept. Maybe the real question isn't why they weren't afraid of the dark. Maybe it's why we forgot how not to be.